Okay, welcome back to another author interviews at Crystal Lake. And today our guest is author CL Kelley, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. So take it away. And we have a lovely little beep for her too.
Hi, yes, my name is CL Kelley. I'm the writer that's being interviewed today. I write in the horror genre. I have a previous collection of short stories that I self-published a few years ago. And mostly right now, I'm focusing on promoting my first traditionally published work, which is my novel, Corpus.
Okay, so give everybody a quick view of that book corpus.
Well, it is a vampire novel, but I tried to kind of do something a little different with it. I wanted to really steer away from a lot of the kind of vampire cliches that have been popping up in, popular culture over the last, 10, 20 years and go towards something a little bit older, but still kind of set it in a very modern urban setting, and focus on having the vampires as the main characters, but have them portrayed in a way that is um, more in keeping with what I feel is their kind of fundamentally alien nature.
Okay, did something specific inspire the book, or did you just want to explore the vampire myths?
Usually with any kind of inspiration with my work, it's a lot of different little things that kind of end up kind of coalescing together over time and inspiring it. When I was in college, many years ago now, I played Vampire the Masquerade a good bit. And that sort of, I was already like very into horror and vampires. So, I was looking to do something that was like a game that was a get together with my college friends. And they already had experience doing, role playing games with that. So we ended up on that one. Um, and that really let me kind of explore, the different sort of vampire archetypes. And that made me want to like dig a little bit further into how those translated into kind of cultural archetypes that that work was drawing from, and getting more into like older vampire folklore. So that was an inspiration. Although when I was writing it, I was trying to kind of steer away from the like sort of um, classification system and kind of the rigid classification system that game sort of like necessity has to do. Um, I've always been interested in myths of like vampires and shapeshifters, so I drew on that. Um, it was as the time kind of geared up to really put the idea together. It did kind of start as a bit of a reaction to the popularity of Twilight at the time, and going a little bit further, the popularity of things like Interview with the Vampire, where the vampire is portrayed as this sort of like world weary, sad, kind of tormented figure that was kind of glamorized and had a lot of like sex appeal. Not that I think those things are invalid necessarily, but that wasn't what I was wanting to go for. I wanted to make the vampires in my work a lot more like bestial and a lot less still having their human nature. Um, and then I would say the last big thing that was an inspiration was a novel that I read back in early college called More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon. And it involved a group of like people with sort of like extrasensory powers kind of teaming together to form sort of like a hive mind of powers. And I thought that idea was really interesting. Like, this was, I can't remember the exact date that it was written, but I think this came pre like X-Men and everything like that. So, and then, while we're mentioning Theodore Sturgeon, if you ever want to read a vampire novel that is really different from a lot of other stuff, I would also recommend reading his novel More Than, what was it, Some of Your Blood, which is a great vampire novel. That's something that I read way later in the process, so it wasn't an inspiration really. I'd already written the book by then, but that is a great vampire novel. So there's definitely some interesting things out there, and I really wanted to kind of introduce something different into the mix than kind of what had been flooding the market. Um,
Yeah, a lot of the romanticized vampire stuff are, I would think, more influenced by Hollywood than
yes,
some of the older myths. Because I've also written a vampire novella, and I researched the mythology, and it's surprising how the vampire goes across cultures in various
yes,
forms too.
yeah. There's so many cultures have some sort of undead creature that comes back and comes back from the grave, some kind of revenant or ghoul or something. So it's interesting that those are sort of almost universal mythological experiences for people.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the main character who's a villain protagonist. So, how did you approach that type of main character, and what was the focus that you had for his character arc?
Well, I try to make sure that I was giving each character of the main quartet sort of equal screen time, I guess, equal screen time. Um, of course, I enjoyed writing some more than others. Uh, and as far as what I would consider the sort of mastermind of the quartet is also the most mysterious member of the gang. So we don't really get a lot of insight into their background and mind. Um, and part of that is because it was just writing characters that I wanted to really keep not humanize them too much. To avoid that, I also had to kind of embrace that I was writing for a very alien mindset and a mindset that was had very different goals from what like a human would have, especially because these characters, one of the big things that I was emphasizing was that they have no real sense of identity or continuity of their life. Like they're just kind of like day to day creatures. So they don't really have a sense of this is what I've done, this is where I've been, this is where I'm going. They're just sort of like cursed to be animals of the moment. So writing that and writing something that just was not really human anymore was pretty challenging to not fall back on the comfort of like this is what a normal person would do. So I think that was definitely the hardest thing to do while I was writing.
Okay, so you mentioned you have other main characters, and you got shapeshifters, monster hunters, and like you said, multiple perspectives. So, how did you all mesh it together? And did any of the characters try to sneak in and take over the book?
Well, I've definitely had characters in my fiction that got really greedy for page time and sort of took on lives of their own. I wrote a short story a few years back where a character that was just supposed to be in one scene, it was literally supposed to be a background character, became one of the major characters of the story. That she was just insisting to be in the story. I feel like I had a little bit more control of these characters than that, but as I went through each cycle of the draft and it got bigger and bigger and I explored more and more to other backgrounds, um, yeah, they sort of started asserting themselves a little bit more for good or for ill because a few of them are pretty unpleasant to spend time around. And as far as the monster hunters, they were going to be in my first few drafts. There were a lot less characterization there, and as I sort of like added on, I wanted to kind of beef their part up a little bit, beef their personalities up, and give them sort of distinct quirks and powers, just like the main group, so they would act as sort of like reflections of each other. In sort of like instead of having sort of a dark reflection of yourself, you have a somewhat lighter reflection of yourself, but they're still not very nice people. They're not really the good guys either.
So the whole book is very morally gray then.
Yes, yes, you have the vampire characters who definitely are not good people. They're definitely interested in feeding off of people and causing suffering, but they end up having sort of a goal that is weirdly noble in its way. And then you have the group of people fighting those people, but not because they're trying to protect people, but just because that's what they do. And if innocent people get in the way of them saving them, then they'll kill them to save them.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. So, what's your favorite scene without giving spoilers in the book?
Well, one of the things about this book is it's a little different from a lot of other stuff I've written because it's a lot more action oriented. A lot of my other work is a lot more like psychological and surreal. It's like you can't really fight against whatever's bothering you. These have more tangible sources. So I was throwing in a lot of, fights and power show offs and things. It felt very much like I was writing sort of a dark superhero story a few times. So I think the final confrontation, this sort of like big climactic scene of the book, is probably was my favorite to write. It was also the most difficult to write because I was bouncing around about 7 or 8 different points of view and trying not to like mix them up. That was a big part of the editing process, was just making sure that people weren't saying names that they weren't supposed to know, or things like that. It's like this person can't call this character this because they don't know that that character is called that, and just keeping everything consistent. That was a headache, but I feel like it's a lot smoother now, and it plays very cinematically.
Okay, so what was the hardest scene emotionally for you to write?
Emotionally, it's kind of hard to say because there's not really a lot I feel in the book that particularly tugs at heartstrings. It's much more like sort of like pulpy. But I think like toward the end, when all the characters were sort of having their final realization, their final confrontations with their identity, that did feel kind of emotionally raw for me because that's something that everyone struggles with, is like, who am I, why am I here, what's the point of what I'm doing, am I working toward any sort of larger goal? And even with them and their sort of twisted minds, I could relate to that and feeling like, hey, what am I doing here? Am I contributing anything, or am I just sort of drifting through the day and day like a robot? So that was something that sort of like I let my emotions kind of come out a little there.
Okay, so why did you decide to write in the horror genre?
It was never really a decision. Like, the interest in horror has been my thing since I was a kid. I mean, since I was single digits, I was reading ghost stories and drawing monsters and sneaking out of my bedroom at night to hide behind the couch and watch horror movies when my parents weren't paying attention. Um, I saw the opening bits of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 when I was 5. Definitely don't recommend that when you're 5 years old. But I've always been sort of like very like just lasered in on that, and that point, and wanting to explore that. I think part of it is I had a lot of anxiety as a kid, so that was sort of a way to sort of by proxy deal with the things that scared me on my own terms. And in time, I think that writing horror allowed me to be the one scaring people instead of getting scared.
A way to control the fear, if you will.
Yes, and if I could write things that scared me and share them with other people, it was a way of me sort of communicating, like, "Hey, this is what it's like to be in my head." So, welcome.
Okay, so what do you enjoy most about writing horror?
Um, you know, I think that horror is such a fluid genre. It's so adaptable. There's so many different things that you can do with it. You can go psychological, you can go surreal, experimental, you can, do monster creature features. There's so many things that you could do, either with a big bang or just very, very subtly. And I think that's sort of like freedom to move around in that, and the freedom to explore what is scary and what makes other people frightened, and all of that is just, to me, this incredible sandbox. And it's something that people, like, everybody shares. Every culture has some sort of monster myth, or dark creature that they talk about and tell stories about. So I think horror, more than some other genres, speaks to something very deep down and very human, and that makes it just very, very fun to explore and very rewarding.
Okay, so what's the hardest part about writing horror fiction?
The hardest part is definitely not falling back on like the sort of safe cliches, the like the jump scare, the sort of like easy like let's write a book about somebody running around in a mask killing people. That can be done very well. I recently read Clown in a Cornfield, and I felt like that was a very kind of fresh breath of air into like a very traditional slasher plot. So it can be done well. But I try to avoid falling back on sort of like the old tried and true stories, or at least do something very different with them. Um, so I think that that's making sure you're not just playing the old hits is definitely, I think, the hardest part of writing horror.
Yeah, you don't want to get too comfortable.
Exactly, and I mean, hey, that works for some people, and I'm sure if like somebody was paying me thousands of dollars to turn out something, I probably wouldn't argue with them too much.
Okay, so who are some of your favorite authors?
Um, I would say probably I grew up reading, the really standard like beginner's kit of horror, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, stuff like that. I still read their work, but it's kind of moved on from there. I would say the first writer that I really experienced that had a palpable impact on like what I wrote, how I wrote, the themes I wrote was Ramsey Campbell, because I discovered one of his anthologies when I was pretty young and read them, and it was just so strange and so unlike any other horror thing that I had read. It's just these bizarre things happening, and there's really no explanation for what they are or why they're happening, and just that very sort of like quiet style. And of course, that led me back into his influences, people like M.R. James, which I feel is like some of the best ghost stories ever written. Um, and people like Fritz Leiber. And that was somebody who, wrote in a lot of different genres, science fiction, fantasy, horror. But I feel like his urban horror stories were particularly compelling to me. Things like Our Lady of Darkness and stories like Smoke Ghost and The Button Molder. Just that sort of like very strange, unexplained urban horror really clicked with me. Um, Harlan Ellison is somebody that I feel like is a big creative influence, not necessarily a style influence, because I don't really like write like him at all. But as far as just the attitude of like,
Yeah.
pursue this raw creativity, just go wherever it takes you and don't be apologetic for where it takes you, has definitely been inspirational. And I would say um, two other big people that have influenced me have been, particularly in the short story um, genre, which is where I write most of my stuff, is people like Thomas Ligotti and Dennis Etchison. I adore Dennis Etchison's stories. They're just so finely crafted. It's like reading like someone who just it's like looking at like an intricate watch and just appreciating this intricate craftsmanship. I really appreciate people who've been able to turn the short story into this finely tuned work of art like that. Usually my short stories kind of get away from me and become like novellas, and then like in instance like this they've just become novels because I just can't shut up.
Yeah, sometimes short stories do get away from you, all right. I was gonna write a short story that turned into a trilogy, so
Well, I haven't quite had that happen yet, but I have definitely had a short story turn into a novel.
okay, so what do you like to do when you're not writing? Any hobbies or hidden talents?
Um, well, one of my big things that I like to do is music. That's something that I came to when I was a little bit older, so I'm very like amateur, self-taught, but it brings me a lot of joy. I actually when I finished a few really big works, I took a break from writing, almost wrote nothing for like a couple years, and I just focused on writing music and recording music and It's not that good, but it was my creative flame at the time. So I had to see where it would take me. And at the very least, I could say, "Hey, I did that," and I'm proud of what I accomplished on my own. But I feel like I'm getting back more into the swing of writing now. And other than that, I just read voraciously, play a lot of video games, um, and try to sleep as much as possible. Sleeping is definitely a big passionate hobby of mine.
Yeah, I wish I could, get more into that hobby, I tell you. But, okay, so one of my other hobbies actually interferes with that one. So, so you mentioned you previously published a collection of short stories. It's called Uncanny Tales. So tell us a little bit about that and any
um,
of your other works that you wanna mention.
Yeah, so like Uncanny Tales was born of about a decade of short story writing. The fruit of that really began in college when I did sort of like a creative writing thesis, and I basically wrote my own sort of like monster anthology there. Some of the stories were meh, and some of the stories I really wanted to revisit with sort of a fresh lens. So that became the core of the sort of group of stories that became Uncanny Tales. During that time, I was, a parent of two young kids. I was working full time, trying to support them. So I didn't really have instances where I was just sitting at a computer and waiting for the ideas to flow. I was carrying a notepad around with me, and I was writing while I was doing laundry at the laundromat, or at my lunch breaks at work, or I'm sure I probably wrote it sitting in gridlock sometimes. Just those little tiny moments that you could steal and write longhand. I still have a tendency to write my first drafts longhand, even now that I have more time. That might be switching now because, gosh, writing longhand really hurts my hands. So that we might have to switch there. But yeah, those stories, I try to explore a lot of things. A lot of those stories are a lot more surreal horror. Some people that have read them have compared them to things like the Twilight Zone, which was another big influence growing up. I was always up for the Twilight Zone movie, marathons that they had on, like, I think it was the Sci-Fi Channel back
Yeah.
in like the late '90s. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, there's a Twilight Zone marathon. I'll
Yeah,
watch this for 7 straight hours now.
the New Year's Day Twilight Zone
Yes,
marathon.
yes. I was always down for those. So yeah, that was an influence, and I'm happy with a lot of the stories in that book. I wish that I'd maybe been more patient and tried to publish that traditionally. I'd had a few of those stories published in magazines. But basically, what happened was I had a full time job, and my job decided to outsource my department and fire all of us 2 weeks before Christmas. So
Ooh.
I said, while I'm sitting here and waiting for my resumes to come back and I have this free time that I'm not using job hunting, why don't I just publish these stories I'm sitting on? Because hey, why not? I just want to get them out there. Um, so it hasn't really netted me any money, but they're out there and people have enjoyed them. So I'm proud of it.
Well, that's always good too. I mean, and yeah, you never know. Who knows? Maybe someday they will take off and be bestsellers.
Maybe.
Okay, so what can readers expect from you in the future? Do you have any projects lined up?
Oh yeah, I've got a few things that are a few balls I'm sort of juggling in the air. Right now, I'm almost finished with my next novel, which is a much more sort of like psychological horror. That's something that I wrote. Probably finished the first draft of that maybe 6 years ago, and I had to kind of. It was very emotionally draining, so I had to kind of just sit with it and not think about it for a little while. But I went back and started to add to it, and that long short story ended up ballooning into a novel. So because I just had so much more I wanted to like parse out in the story. So I'm most of the way done with that. And then I have a few other things kicking around. I've wanted to sort of dive back into my Southern roots and do some stories kind of exploring a Southern Gothic, Southern horror kind of thing, because I feel like I've spent a lot of my life sort of like running from that background, and I want to sort of try to re-embrace, you know, the kind of just very weird stuff I grew up hearing from relatives and people, and strange little backwoods ways. And then I have some stuff where I think I want to write some stuff with sort of maybe a recurring character, sort of like a paranormal investigator character, but I'm trying to do it in a way where I don't have to, break out the sort of, what do they call those? Like electronic voice phenomenon things, and like we've got a reading, and I just kind of want to steer away from all that like ghost hunters sort of stuff. So I'm trying to figure out a way where it's not that, but it's not someone going like I'm sensing a ghost. So trying to strike a good balance.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap the interview up there, and I'd like to thank you for being a guest today. It was a pleasure
Of
chatting with
course.
you.
Thank you. It's very nice. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Bye for now.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.